Hey, Pretentious Engineer here. I know you didn't ask, but I help engineers, global leaders, and entrepreneurs find their way. Now, the journey of an engineer is often disorienting, undefined, and isolating. And I've made it my personal mission to provide greater clarity, a bounded career path, and community to folks like myself, hoping to secure their next best opportunity. After over a decade advancing surgical robotics, device innovation, and VR at J&J, I made a strategic exit to continue my family's journey in Japan. This was one of the most challenging decisions I've ever made in life. Many folks get stuck in jobs that don't have their best interests in mind, and my flagship course, How to Say Goodbye, will empower you to craft your own strategic exit, targeting an opportunity at a 30% pay increase, living wherever you desire, and loving what you do. I genuinely believe this is possible for you, and my community on Skool is here to support you in the journey. Many colleagues of mine struggle to discern how my wife and I were able to navigate various immigration, housing, financial, and employment risks during our strategic exit in Japan. So I decided to synthesize everything we've learned so you can progress out of that job that's killing you inside. If I can do it, you can do it too. This course is broken into 3 major movements, first of which is inertia, which illuminates all the constraining forces that keep you in a job that doesn't have your best interests in mind, limiting your future possibilities. The second movement, impact, which will continue today, acknowledges an intentional choice to break through these inertial forces in pursuit of securing your next. The final movement, momentum, contains the secret sauce of how I exited J&J with my 2 greatest assets intact, my integrity and my network. I'm committed to helping you exit with both so your reputation will prosper, leading to downstream opportunities. So, how will you plan your strategic exit? Let's find out together. Ikimashou. Let's go. If you lead with intention, you'll find yourself acquiring allies over the years. The individuals you trust when the workplace shifts into Lord of the Flies. One such ally in my life was Chuck. A wizard of sorts, he shaped countless MedTech innovation landscapes at Johnson & Johnson, and his patent collection is extensive. When I was a co-op, I attended a TIDLIC, which is Things You Don't Learn in College. He gave a lecture about this, and that's when we became friends. He became a constant in my career during my 10 years at Johnson & Johnson. He was one of the first individuals I sought when I began my strategic exit from Johnson & Johnson. I remember both his shock and beaming smile as I discussed my contingent resignation from J&J to provide my family with continuity in Japan. But most importantly, I remember 2 pieces of wisdom he shared. First of which, your risk tolerance is unfathomable to me, which was honestly a compliment and humbling at the same time. And second, I look forward to hearing your TED Talk when you share the secrets of your overnight success. The crazy jump to Japan, failing again, and then becoming wildly successful. So today, I'd like to unpack the unfathomable risks we tolerated during my exit, so you can do the same for yours. 10 weeks is not a lot of time, so naturally we needed to make the most of every day as we prepared to leave the safety net of J&J and continue life in Japan. So let me grab my tablet and let's get to work. All right, so the first thing we want to work through is what actions do you need to take to mitigate a risk? And this is really a working framework driven by something called FMEAs that I leverage all the time as a systems engineer. And FMEA just stands for it's an acronym, FMEA, and that just stands for failure modes effects analysis. We're all nerds here, so we can navigate this. So basically, if you're designing a widget, like a medical device that's going inside of somebody's body that seals thoracic tissue or lung tissue, you might have a failure mode where the stapler doesn't fire the staples, it just cuts. All right, so that would be really bad. So if you wanted to look at the mode of that failure, right, like it's because something occurs in your mechanism that prevents it from forming all these little tiny staples through the lungs. But the effect of that is that you would transect lung tissue without sealing, which would cause immense bleeding. And that's the analysis you would start to do, is like look at the risk of that. So you'd look at the severity of that failure, which is incredibly high, like patient can bleed out almost immediately. And then there's like multiple levels though that occur, like maybe minor bleeding occurs, severe bleeding, patient dies. They have to progress from a laparoscopic procedure, which is through small ports, into an open procedure. Like you could go through all those. And then part of the analysis is based on the severity and the probability of that occurring. You could start to calculate your risk. The higher the risk, the more requirements you need to mitigate it. So you might have like certain mechanisms that ensure that staples form every time. Well, I wanted to take this FMEA mindset, and I leveraged it kind of naturally, to look at all the risks associated with leaving a US-based company sponsoring us in Japan and continuing the journey. Because when we moved to Japan, we had a full package, which means J&J covered international schooling, which was $18,000 per kid. They covered all housing expenses, so our lease was signed up with them. They were providing me base pay in USD. They were also offsetting all of our taxes so that we weren't getting double taxed between Japan and US. They gave us a private medical. Like there's all these things. And if I left J&J to stay in Japan, it all evaporates. So there's huge risks associated with it. That's what Chuck was talking about. So what I want to walk through is the actions I took to mitigate these risks. And then you could figure out what actions you need to take to mitigate your own risks, leveraging that FMEA kind of mindset. Let me erase that really quick because I'm particular. It'll be worth it. Isn't this magical? Okay, clean slate. So first thing I want to talk through is we only had 10 weeks. So we were going back and forth. I was on parental leave trying to figure out, like, are we staying in J&J? Are we leaving? If we leave, what do we do? And finally, the point of decision happened with only a 10-week lead time. So we made this giant whiteboard that had my whys, my wife's whys, our fears, and then we had these swim lanes for 10 weeks, week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, and each lane had a different thing we had to navigate. One was housing, one was transitioning from J&J, one was me securing a job, my wife securing a job, and we had one fifth one I can't remember right now. But I'll share the picture of it because I took a picture of it. That'll be in the Skool community. So in these 10 weeks, the first thing we had to navigate, oh, I'm underlining something you can't see, but it was important. Housing risks. So my lease was tied up with J&J, which meant as soon as I told J&J, I was nervous they may fire me. I wasn't sure how this would work because you only need to put in 2 weeks notice, but we knew we were making the decision longer than 2 weeks out. So one of the things we had to figure out is, like, how do we secure our own housing in Japan? As a foreigner, it's very difficult to secure a lease on your own. Japan's very particular about it. You need something called a guarantor that kind of co-signs, and you need to prove to the guarantor that you are of financial means to do so. So before I ever formally quit J&J, we had already worked with our friends to find an alternative house that was very small. It's like a 3 LDK, so it had 3 bedrooms. It's tight for 4 people. It's very Japanese style. And we found the only one that was kind of co-located with our kids' schooling at a price point that we projected we could meet. It's basically the same cost as like living in Ohio, where we were originally from. We co-signed leveraging pay stubs from Johnson & Johnson. So we never disclosed that, hey, I'm about to quit and find something else. Like, we signed the lease at risk because we thought we'd be successful in our ventures. We thought we had enough burn rate that we'd be fine. So we basically had to triage housing because the worst case scenario that we could see is we quit, but then we have nowhere to move to because our lease ends with J&J. So we put all our effort on that initially. And that's why that was one of the primary swim lanes. We can't live in Japan if we don't have a house. The second one, which was very particular, was what I called, like, oh, I have to write it. Sorry, I'm being so silly. Timing smoke screen. J&J. This was really hard for me, and I want to have a discussion about honesty. By the way, my son's fine. He's just exploring his world. So I'm on baby duty while the kids are seeing a Cinderella play with my wife, which is fun. But basically, I'm a very honest person. And it was challenging for me to know that I had made a decision, but I hadn't disclosed the decision because I needed to navigate the housing risk. If we couldn't secure a lease, I couldn't quit. That was at least my threshold of like, that risk is too high. We have to just go to New Jersey, regardless of all the whys and things we thought about, right? So what I did is kind of a smokescreen. It would have been ideal to land the business development job that we talked about in a prior module, which would have kept me in Japan. I would have loved to have had that decision before I ever needed to make a contingent resignation with J&J, but timing was imperfect and leadership was not accommodating, um, which I hope to lead differently if I have a large global team in the future. I hope nobody on my team ever experiences what we had to navigate, because as we get to module 7, where I teach you how to write a resignation letter, we're going to read the resignation letter I wrote, and the choices we had to face as a family were impossible. Hopefully your choices are much more within safe bounds, but if you navigate this risk management approach, you can have a great transition with no negative financial or housing or visa impacts. So I had to smoke screen, which meant like I had to kind of progress this job opportunity with Japanese business development. And then when I shared the contingent resignation decision, after stalling a bit, I was able to leverage the last couple weeks of work and getting paid to secure our move. So I wasn't really working because my role had ended. I was potentially starting this new role. So I created slush time where I was still getting a paycheck every 2 weeks coming off of parental leave, but not necessarily like doing innovation, because I was like, hey, if I'm going to live in Japan, I have to move. Like, this is another relocation on behalf of J&J. And then after 5 interviews, they made a decision that actually still shocks me of not hiring me for a role that I was like super qualified for, in my opinion. That's a whole nother, we'll talk about that on like the community. So I did a lot of smoke screening. One of my working frameworks for this, because I come from like a faith context, there's someone named Rahab who lied in order to protect Israelites that were scoping out a territory called Jericho that eventually was invaded by the Israelites, and like Rahab survived. And it was one of those areas where like she's in the lineage of Christ and was dishonest in order to protect certain people. And for me, I recognized in this transition I had to protect my family, because the indifference of J&J towards our circumstances was going to put us in a very, very bad situation. So for you, you might have situations where you've resolved that you're going to quit, that your life's not replaceable, but you still have to show up to work every day for weeks or even months, knowing that you're doing certain activities to position yourself in a better hiring position external. And I just want to affirm that you have to care for yourself, because these companies aren't necessarily going to care for you. And no company is going to like happily watch you go. Well, maybe. Okay. That's timing. That's smokescreen. The next risk we had to navigate was cash flow. And there's 2 ways we navigated it: paychecks and a personal loan. Leading up to my exit, I had talked with a MedTech personal recruiter who gave me some projections on different roles I could be eligible for, timing, and I really thought it was likely I'd just move into a global leadership role and stay in MedTech at a competing company of J&J. So I had projected that I'd be getting like signing bonuses and stuff at a certain time. None of these ended up being true because life is uncertain and stuff happened, and we went into entrepreneurship. But by smoke screening J&J, it extended how long I was getting paid by J&J to give us a little bit more financial runway in our exit in Japan. That was huge. And then we pulled a personal loan of about $75K, leveraging my J&J salary, because you have to prove proof of salary. So I knew if I tried to pull a loan after leaving J&J, it would be way more challenging. So we had to get all this done while I had like paychecks every 2 weeks to prove that I could sign a lease, to prove that I can get the loan, to give us the runway to continue. So that's how we managed the cash flow risk. And then we assumed my wife would get hired teaching, which was a false assumption. Whole nother story. And we also assumed that I would get hired quickly and have a signing bonus. And that didn't happen because we had to pivot towards entrepreneurship. based on the yen being low. I couldn't get the right job at the right pay to keep going, so we had to build a business instead. Okay, next one. This one's fun. Visa security. So we needed to make sure we could legally live in Japan after we left with J&J. So I talked with immigration. I found different visa pathways to start my own company to continue life in Japan through the Shibuya startup visa, which would have given us a year or 2 years of legal visa sponsorship before progressing into a business manager visa. I wanted to understand how long could you be unemployed in Japan without being kicked out of Japan and figure out the timing risk for that. So we did a lot of work to understand immigration, because when we moved to Japan, Johnson & Johnson had an immigration team. They just did the papers to get us there legally. I didn't do any of that. Upon the exit, it was all on us to figure it out. So that was a big risk. The next one that I'll share, Joe Dash, Felicia Jobs. Me and Felicia had 2 different running lists on like what we thought we could do for employment. Even me looking at working at our kids' schooling, my wife working at the kids' school to subsidize the schooling. We had a lot of assumptions around both of our employment potentials in Japan, and we were putting a lot of emphasis on that. But the first priority we had, the highest risk, was housing and smokescreen. So we decided we could kind of quit at risk and figure it out downstream based on pulling the loan, having a burn rate that would give us 4 to 6 months of financial runway, basically. So we actually didn't make jobs the highest priority, but we wanted to have a plan on how we'd navigate that risk as well. And then the last one is medical. This one we actually navigated shortly after exiting Johnson & Johnson and ran into a lot of problems with our assumptions, but we thought we could just get on a Japanese medical plan easily. Turns out they wanted like multiple years of back taxes because we were in Japan, but we were only paying into US Social Security, not Japanese Social Security. So one of the reasons we actually had to exit was because they were expecting an incredibly high payment for us to join Japanese medical. It wasn't as economical to us as others who immigrate to Japan and start in a non like expat role right away. If we had worked for a Japanese company from the start, would have been no problem getting medical. But because we worked in Japan for 2.5 years on private health insurance, it took a lot of conversations for us to be able to get medical legally, which is why it was cost prohibitive for us. We did no medical in Japan for 4 or 5 months. Very scary. Okay. So those were all of the ways, the actions I took to mitigate my own risk, which hopefully like you're not sweating or anxious from what we had to navigate. Going through all this 6 months later, I was like, whew, we were crazy. So hopefully it's a little bit easier for you. So praxis, let's put it into practice for you. I'm talking fast because I can tell this guy's going to need lunch in about 5 minutes. So the first one, what lead times are most sensitive in your transition? So here, let's say you just got laid off, which is possible. I'm sure there are members of our community that have been laid off recently. You have until your 3 to 6 month severance runs out. I got no severance in this transition. So I had no buffer, right? We had to take on debt to exit, with the risk of J&J coming back for tuition and other stuff we talked about. So for you, you have to figure out like how long do you have to solve some of your problems? When is your mortgage payment at risk? When is providing food for your family at risk? You have to calculate that and then kind of work backwards. If you're in a job that's hard and you did your ikigai to figure out it's time to look external, if you have 6 months or 8 months to figure out the transition, some of the stuff we'll talk about with building a personal brand and like how to actually secure your next, you could do very, very well in this transition. If you're working with 3 months, you're going to have to compromise somewhere. Like you might have to take a role that's not perfect just to get cash flow going. But if it's longer and you can make certain partners wait, you could land something very peculiar to really secure a great next opportunity. So everyone's got different choices ahead of them based on their circumstance. Next one. What risks should be I forgot a U. No, I didn't. Shoot. Let's just rewrite it. Burned down first. This exercise of laying out 10 weeks to change our life and all these different like flow charts or like swim lanes was huge because it helped me and Felicia both look at it and be like, we're not going to be able to get a job before we quit J&J. That's what we want. That's everything we've been told and taught. We're in an inversion. So if we take this personal loan and we smokescreen J&J, we can increase our financial runway because we have to secure housing now. We can't leave this job without housing because where would we live with 4 kids, right? So if you could figure out which risks are highest, you could burn them down first. If you're trying to get more engagement on LinkedIn and you have no personal brand and no content, it's probably the first thing you need to start to focus on is you're invisible. So you're going to be a resume and a stack, and there's going to be another course I do on how to land a job. Right now, this is how to say goodbye, like how to reach the point of like, we need to exit. There's a lot you could do to burn down the risk of being invisible to other organizations and establish yourself as a key person of influence in a niche. And then that helps you have better pricing control and negotiations if you land a job. Or if you decide, if I make this much money on the side, I can quit and do entrepreneurship full time. You have to figure out which risk you have to burn down in order to do that in parallel to your day job. All right. Last one. What actions are you most insecure about taking? I wrote these questions months ago. This is a good one. For us, it was really scary to sign a lease without having 100% confidence we could pay it forever. It's very scary to quit a job without having a job lined up with 4 kids in a foreign country. It's huge insecurity there. For you, you might be insecure about needing to do a little bit of smoke screening, like continuing to show up to work, continuing to do a good job, continuing to have friendships without grabbing lunch with people and be like, hey, like I'm going to quit in a couple months. Like not being perfectly honest is hard for some people in order to self-preserve, but you don't want to get fired. Although actually getting fired might help you if you get severance. So there's lots of different pathways to navigate it. But I would look at the ones that make you most uncomfortable because that will be the action that's hardest to prioritize, but it's probably associated with one of your highest risks. So you have to make yourself do some of these things to actually get synergy. Otherwise, you'll stay a frog in a pot. Otherwise, you'll stay cuffed in your gold, right? So anyway, these are how you can plan your exit. The next module, let me skip ahead for a second, is going to be what would your future look like if you bet on yourself? So we're going to have a little bit of discussion on how you can secure your next best opportunity. You've made the choice that your life's not replaceable. You got to go and live it and make it yourself. You have to plan your exit. Now let's secure the next opportunity. Let's land a job or an entrepreneurial venture that makes sense for you and build the life you desire. So anyway, friends, keep changing the world. You can sip on that. See you on the next one.